The story begins with a woman covering her lower face with an elegant fan, and her name is Elaine Farrens. In her eyes, noble lineage and personal wealth mean absolutely everything in life, and she has traveled down a long and ruthless road simply in pursuit of greater power. She believes that this unending ambition is the very definition of what it truly means to be herself, the proud wife of Duke Farrens. And yet, despite her extreme coldness, she still held a deep and genuine love within her heart for her husband and their children. To ensure that her eldest son achieved absolute success as a high-ranking noble, she used all her influence to bribe, threaten, and coax those in power for everything they were worth. To entangle her eldest daughter directly with the royal bloodline, she carefully manipulated the young prince's affections and even orchestrated their final marriage proposals in the end. Her second eldest son wished to make a great name for himself as a famous swordsman, so she poured her family's vast wealth into the hands of renowned warriors and powerful martial families. Furthermore, her second daughter possessed an exceptional natural talent as a magician, so she aimed to raise the girl to eventually become the head of the elite academy for magic, making sure to tip her valuable connections at her former school very generously. Elaine questioned whether all of these desperate actions were not born directly from motherly love, wondering if her sacrifices were truly wrong. Before she could finish her silent thoughts, her daughter called out to her, begging her mother to please give up her futile struggle. Elaine addressed her daughter by name, asking Lily why on earth she was pointing her magic staff directly at her own mother and demanding to know what she had done wrong. Before she could finish her sentence, Lily stated that her mother knew exactly what terrible sin she had committed. Lily revealed that their father had already been officially executed by the authorities, and both of her brothers had met the exact same tragic fate as well. Both women were standing alone inside a burning, crumbling hallway, and Lily stated that the only members left of their entire family were just her mother and herself. Hearing this horrible news, her mother desperately suggested that they run away together, claiming that with Lily's immense magic and her own remaining connections, they could still escape and survive. However, Lily softly replied by asking if her mother had not already done enough damage to the world, pointing out their family's unforgivable sin of trying to replace the royal family through an act of total treason against the nation. Suddenly, heavy burning debris fell down from the ceiling, but her mother quickly dodged out of the way. Lily urged her mother to accept their rightful punishment and disappear quietly from the world. Raising her glowing wand high into the air, Lily bade her mother a final goodbye, telling her not to worry because the spell would not hurt a single bit, and promising that she would follow her into death shortly after. Elaine shielded her body in terror, begging her daughter to stop the attack. Lily let out a heavy, solemn sigh and cast her powerful spell, Pomalazzo, directly striking her own mother. In an instant, Elaine completely vanished from the burning room. The scene then suddenly shifts to someone experiencing a wave of blinding physical agony, thinking to themselves that the pain was unbearable. Her womb burned with an intense torture so severe that she felt like she could die, reflecting that she had only ever felt this specific kind of extreme pain 4 times in her entire past life. The voice of someone shouting her name echoed in the background, desperately telling her to keep pushing forward. As her blurry vision slowly returned, she realized she was lying down upon a clean bed. She was thoroughly shocked when she looked around the room and saw a team of professional midwives attending to her. A young man was gently holding her hand, telling her that it would only take a little more effort and reassuring her that the best healers and midwives were right here to protect her. She let out a loud shout of pain, realizing in complete disbelief that she was somehow giving birth to a 5th child. After the exhausting ordeal was over, she found herself holding a softly crying baby in her arms. She glanced over toward the nearby window and looked down at her reflection, realizing in complete shock that this younger body belonged to her 20-year-old self. Just then, the young man approached her bed and praised her for a job well done, announcing with immense pride that the baby was the very first child of the Farrens family and a healthy son. The man then grew slightly shy and stammered that a baby girl would have been lovely as well, explaining that he only cared about the boy because of the irritating old noble ladies within their family and insisted he did not mean anything bad by it. In her mind, Elaine recognized that this man was her husband, Clement, looking completely young again, and the baby in her arms was their very first child. She was struck with the mind-blowing realization that she had somehow traveled backward 30 years into the past. Elaine thought deeply about the timeline, remembering every single event that was supposed to happen next. In her past life, the Farrens family flourished under the leadership of their brilliant young lord. They were blessed once again with their second daughter and son, both of whom possessed incredible, prodigious power. Meanwhile, working secretly from the dark shadows, Elaine plotted total treason against the royal family by scheming, operating behind the scenes, and laying down a vast web of deadly traps. She had been halfway to achieving her dark goals before everything came crashing down around her, ensuring that in 30 years' time, the proud House of Farrens would fall to complete ruin. While calmly sipping a warm cup of coffee, her expression turned completely serious as she declared to herself that she had absolutely no intention of ever repeating that tragic path again. Her husband noticed her staring at him so intensely and cleared his throat nervously, asking if there was something specific she wanted to tell him. Elaine replied that there indeed was, silently wondering to herself why her young husband was blushing so cutely in front of her. While holding her new baby, Elaine announced that she was thinking of naming him Sieghart. In her mind, she reflected on how she was giving him the exact same name as before, admitting that she had briefly worried whether she ought to give him a completely different name this time around. She figured she must have looked quite indecisive to those around her. Clemens smiled warmly at the suggestion, repeating the name and noting that they could call him Sieg for short. He let out a gentle laugh, approving of the choice and stating that it was a very good name. Clement then remarked that it had been a long time since the two of them had simply sat down and talked like this, having a sweet, casual chat like a normal married couple. Elaine remembered her original past, realizing that his words were completely true. In the timeline she remembered, they had barely spoken to one another, as she had bitterly rejected both their political marriage and his gentle kindness until the very end of her life. Clement let out another quiet laugh, suggesting that perhaps he could help pick out names for their future children as well. Elaine remembered the exact same scene playing out in her past life, confirming in her mind that her memories were completely accurate. Suddenly, a servant called out to the Duke, apologizing for interrupting their private family conversation to deliver urgent documents that required his official approval. Clement reassured the servant that it was no problem at all, admitting that he was the one who had slipped out of his office to be with his wife. In Elaine's mind, she reflected on how being a duchess had granted her immense wealth, status, and fame. Because of those gifts, she deeply wanted to give her husband wonderful things in return this time, swearing to herself that she would fix all her past mistakes and make everything right. However, she then let out a slightly traumatized, nervous smile, thinking to herself that there was absolutely no way she was ever going to let her daughter Lily kill her again. She felt confident that as long as it was her, changing fate would be entirely possible. To demonstrate her power, she casually lit a warm fire using her magical abilities. Clement thanked Elaine, noting that her magic was just as impressive as ever. The visiting servant gaped in shock, wondering how she could perform incantationless casting so effortlessly, noting that her level of magical control must be equal to the Grand Elders of the famous Magic Tower. In her mind, Elaine recognized that her spellcasting abilities remained at the exact same master level as when she died, placing her magic a full 30 years ahead of everyone else in the current era. She also realized that she still vividly remembered all the detailed plans for future magical inventions. She smiled at her husband, noting that he seemed terribly busy with his work. Clement agreed, explaining that the severe crop damage caused by wild beasts was much worse than usual this year and was currently affecting a massive area of their territory. He sighed, mentioning that there was a massive pile of paperwork to handle, so just verifying the claims and following up on the reports was going to be an exhausting task. Elaine asked if she could perhaps help him with some of the administrative work. Clement looked surprised, asking if she was truly interested in the task. He expressed his gratitude for the offer, but gently pointed out that she did not have much practical experience with this kind of difficult managerial work. Elaine replied that she was simply very worried about the widespread crop damage. In her mind, she smiled knowing that she actually possessed all of her advanced administrative know-how from her previous life, along with complete knowledge of future historical events. Clement continued his explanation, mentioning that there was a strong chance dangerous monsters could be the true cause of the destruction, though he noted there had not been many official reports of monster activity yet, and it was still far too early in the year for their usual breeding season. In Elaine's mind, she calculated her survival strategy, realizing that if she wanted to avoid being murdered by Lily in 30 years, she needed to become much stronger than her daughter. To achieve that level of power, she knew she desperately needed real, life-and-death fighting experience. Putting on a very serious expression, she suggested to her husband that it might be a wonderful idea for her to personally visit the damaged villages and see the situation for herself, recognizing this trip as her very first step toward changing the future. However, her serious moment was suddenly interrupted by the loud crying of her newborn baby. Clement panicked instantly, wondering what was wrong with the child and nervously asking if he needed a diaper change or if they had simply been talking too loudly. Elaine calmly settled the baby, explaining that he was just hungry for milk. Sometime after that day, a special milk warmer machine developed personally by the Duchess became a massive, miraculous hit among housewives everywhere, with local women marveling over what an incredible invention the machine was. Sometime later, a noble carriage carrying Elaine arrived near the troubled region. As they stepped outside into the fresh air, her loyal butler, Walter, noted that the country road here was quite rough and bumpy, asking his lady if she was feeling all right. Elaine told him not to worry at all, noting to herself that at least this time she was not desperately trying to hide her identity while fleeing for her life along muddy animal trails. She briefly remembered her terrifying past escape, recalling the angry royal guards shouting for the traitors and demanding that her family be found and beheaded. Walter looked at her in confusion, asking what she had just said. Elaine quickly dismissed it, stating that it was nothing at all. She then added that she was truly sorry for forcing him to interrupt his comfortable retirement over a small matter like this. Walter smiled brightly at her, assuring her that it was no trouble at all and declaring that he was deeply honored to travel alongside his lady once again. As they walked together toward the damaged village, Walter observed the poor condition of the road, noting that the animal damage appeared to be far worse than the official reports had indicated. He guessed out loud that his lady had likely been suspecting the sudden appearance of hidden monsters all along. Elaine replied calmly that she had only been making an educated guess. Walter stated that if monsters were indeed the cause, they could hope for a very rapid resolution to the problem, smiling as he remarked that this dangerous situation would finally give him his own chance to shine in battle. Elaine confirmed that finding the exact nature of the creature was precisely what they had come to investigate. She questioned what kind of monster could be causing such widespread destruction, noting that discovering the truth was their primary goal. Suddenly, the two travelers stopped walking as a local villager approached them with an irritated sigh. The man complained out loud that he had heard official representatives were finally coming to investigate, only to find a delicate woman and an old butler arriving for what looked like a simple stroll. He clicked his tongue in frustration, sarcastically telling the noblewoman that there was nothing worth seeing in their poor village. Ignoring the man's cold attitude, Elaine knelt down and touched the dirt, observing that the soil in the village looked exceptionally rich and noting that she would not mind taking some for her own collection. Walter looked surprised and asked if studying dirt had become one of her personal hobbies. The villager scoffed, asking if the Duchess was trying to gather soil to build a cute little garden at her luxurious mansion. He warned her that this very soil was what their entire community relied on to survive. In Elaine's mind, she remembered her past life, reflecting on how her last private garden had actually been used to secretly cultivate massive quantities of illegal plants. She reassured the man that her husband would never sacrifice the lives of his people, promising to do everything in her power to protect the village. The group then traveled deeper into Syria village within the 8th region of the Fallen's territory. Upon seeing the true extent of the destruction, Elaine was thoroughly shocked, realizing that the situation was far worse than she had imagined. Walter agreed, stating that this was his very first time seeing normal animals cause such extreme damage. The young villager immediately interrupted, shouting that wild animals were not responsible for the ruined fields. He blamed the village chief, guessing that the chief had probably lied to the authorities by reporting the destruction as attacks by wild deer or demon squirrels. The young man insisted that as an experienced hunter, he had never seen animals leave behind damage like this. Walter urged him to calm down, explaining that the Duchess had traveled to the village specifically because she suspected the very same thing. However, the young man scoffed again, questioning how a wealthy noblewoman who had not lifted a single finger could possibly understand their struggle. In Elaine's mind, she already knew the tragic future awaiting the community. She realized that this entire village would soon fall into total ruin due to an incoming army of monsters. In the memories of her previous life, a massive outbreak of monsters had swept through the entire 8th region. The local people had failed to grasp the true danger until it was far too late, and by the time the royal knights finally arrived to fight, numerous villages had already been burned to the ground. Back then, Elaine had remained safely locked inside her luxurious mansion, so she had never known the exact details of the tragedy. She wondered what specific species of monster could be causing the devastation. Looking out over the ruined crops, Elaine pointed toward the fields and noted that wild deer could jump extremely high, meaning they would never tear up the ground in such a chaotic way. The young hunter was completely stunned, wondering how a noble lady could know such a detailed hunting fact. Suddenly, an older man shouted the young hunter's name, Gast, as he hurried over. The old village chief grabbed Gast by the head and bowed deeply, offering his sincere apologies for the young man's rude behavior. Gast recognized his leader with a groan, right as a tiny girl ran up to join them. The chief scolded Gast for causing trouble again, warning him that offending high-ranking noble guests could cause their local taxes to be raised. The chief complained that the wild animals ruining their crops were already causing enough suffering, but Gast stubbornly insisted that normal animals were not the culprits. Elaine observed the arriving group and noted that the chief had appeared at the perfect moment. She stepped forward toward the small girl, using her specialized charm to gently ask Ruka if she would mind chatting with her for a moment. The little girl acted very shyly, repeating the request in surprise. Elaine told her not to worry and pulled out a sweet treat, using her specialized bribery tactics to win the child's trust. Ruka tasted the candy, her eyes lighting up with joy as she declared how delicious it was. Gast shouted at his little sister, telling her not to accept food from complete strangers. Elaine simply smiled, promising that she would give him some candy later as well, noting in her mind how much the little girl clearly loved the treats. Gast grumbled that the candy was not the main issue. Elaine then asked Ruka if she or the other village children had picked up any shed tails from demon squirrels recently. Both Gast and the village chief looked thoroughly confused by the strange question. Ruka replied that they had not found any, explaining that the local boys had searched through the fields but came back empty-handed and bored. Walter gasped in surprise at the realization. Elaine noted that she now understood the true situation. The chief frantically asked the lady to explain what she meant by her question. Gast let out a sigh, explaining to the chief that because the old man was raised in the city, he did not know that demon squirrels always drop their tails and flee whenever they sense real danger. He added that the children usually collected those dropped tails to use as fun toys, meaning the total absence of shed tails proved that demon squirrels were not the creatures roaming the fields. Ruka excitedly explained that the squirrel tails could stretch out a little bit, making them fun to pull on during playtime. The village chief expressed his total surprise at learning this fact. Elaine pointed out that the main issue was that if demon squirrels were truly responsible for damaging the crops, they would have left plenty of their shed tails behind in the dirt. The chief began to tremble in shock, realizing that squirrels were not the creatures destroying their local harvest. Walter added in a serious tone that wild deer did not appear to be the culprits either. Gast concluded that they were dealing with something possessing a high level of intelligence, and creature clever enough to intentionally hide its presence from the local villagers. Elaine confirmed his suspicion, stating firmly that they were dealing with actual monsters. A small fly buzzed around the group as they stood near the fields. Gast hesitated for a moment before asking if she was truly the high-ranking Duchess of the territory. Elaine confirmed her identity, remarking that she thought her noble appearance made that fact quite obvious. Gast covered his face in utter disbelief, asking what kind of high noble covering herself from head to toe in smelly agricultural fertilizer just to hide. From below the trees, both Elaine and Gast looked upward while Walter observed the area from high up in the branches. Gast noted that she had gone to extreme lengths simply to conceal her human scent from the wild beasts. Elaine replied that using fertilizer was an easy, effective way to hide from monsters that possessed a sharp sense of smell, insisting she saw no problem with her methods. Gast admitted that as a simple hunter, dealing with real monsters was beyond his depth. Elaine told him to relax, noting that while the physical damage was severe, it was not as though they were facing a legendary dragon. Gast questioned whether that statement was supposed to make him feel any calmer. In her mind, Elaine calculated that there would likely be a whole group of monsters rather than a single creature, and they would possess a certain degree of intelligence. While high-level demons would be extremely troublesome, she knew a person did not simply run into them out in a normal forest. She decided to simplify her thinking, reflecting on how she had lived for 50 whole years without ever encountering a member of the dragon tribe. She reasoned that these forest creatures moved in organized groups and likely used basic weapons. Right on cue, the group spotted a pack of forest goblins walking nearby. Gast quietly asked the Duchess if they were going to attack the creatures immediately. Elaine replied that they should hold off, explaining that beating a few scouts would be simple enough, but it would not solve the root problem. Gast asked if she wanted to follow the scouts so they would lead the way to the main herd, and Elaine confirmed that was her exact plan. Gast expressed his shock, asking if she truly intended to track monsters through a dark forest in the middle of the night. Elaine assured him that both she and Walter were more than capable of handling nighttime tracking. Elaine pointed toward the walking forest goblins, and Gast fell completely silent as he looked closer at the pack. He nervously noted that the situation was very bad because the creatures were clumped tightly together. He estimated that there had to be at least 100 goblins gathered in the woods, insisting that they needed to run back to warn the village immediately, even if it meant abandoning the entire settlement to save their lives. Elaine told him there was no need for such drastic measures, asserting that she and her butler could easily handle a group of this size. She called out to Walter to ask if he was ready for combat. Fixing his leather gloves, Walter told his lady to simply give the word. Without a moment of hesitation, Walter leaped high into the air and threw a rain of sharp blades straight down into the goblin horde, piercing cleanly through the monsters. Gast watched the scene in complete amazement as Walter moved with incredible speed to slay the remaining beasts. However, one lone goblin managed to dodge the initial assault and turned to run away. Walter looked up toward his lady, calling out to her to take care of the escapee. The fleeing goblin tried to scramble up a nearby hill, but when it reached the top, it found Elaine standing there ready to strike. Casting her magical skill, Ignis Globus, she launched a fiery attack that blasted the goblin right back down the hillside. She turned to Walter, promising to provide fire support from above and warning him to watch out for her spells, casually mentioning that she could cast any magic spell up to the intermediate rank. Working together in perfect harmony, Elaine cast powerful spells from afar while Walter slashed through the enemy ranks with swift precision. Gast stood completely frozen in awe, thinking to himself that these two noble people were absolute monsters. As he observed the aftermath, he could hardly believe his eyes, wondering how just two human beings had managed to completely wipe out a massive horde of goblins all by themselves. The battlefield was left entirely covered in a giant mountain of monster corpses. Walter bowed deeply to his lady, praising her for her wonderful work and asking where she had managed to learn such a high-level mana efficiency technique. Elaine replied that she had simply studied the magic by herself, adding silently in her mind that she had practiced it for 30 long years. Walter asked if he might be so bold as to request that she teach him the technique. Elaine agreed without hesitation, but she set a clear condition, explaining that he would have to teach her his personal combat skills in return, including both his areas of expertise and his close-quarters battle training. Walter was taken aback, asking if she truly needed more combat training despite the incredible power she already possessed, noting that it felt a little excessive for a high noblewoman. As they walked together toward the village's main crop storage house, they continued their conversation. Elaine told him not to talk like that, teasing him by mentioning she would generously overlook the fact that he had held back some of his true strength during the fight. Walter let out a soft laugh, admitting complete defeat to her sharp perception. Gast ran ahead of them toward the storage building, crying out in relief when he saw that the village's vital food supply was still completely intact. Elaine told him that everything was safe now, though her voice trailed off as she began to closely examine the stored supplies. Elaine observed the remaining food stores and noted that the goblins had stolen the entire resource supply of a whole village, pointing out that what was left in the storage was nowhere near the original amount. She stated that it was only right to assume the monsters had taken the rest of the stolen food somewhere else. Gast asked if perhaps another separate group of monsters was responsible for taking the rest. Walter interjected to explain that normal goblins were not the type of creatures that liked to help each other out, even if they belonged to the exact same species, unless there was a powerful leader directing them. He noted that such a situation would mean there was a mastermind smart enough to coordinate actions between different groups. Elaine confirmed his theory, stating that considering the massive scope of all the affected villages in the territory, she could only think of one specific creature capable of such organization, which was a goblin general actively leading a whole goblin army. Realizing the gravity of the threat, the group immediately began to move quickly. Gast insisted that if a giant army was involved, there was no time to sit around doing nothing, urging that they needed to act fast. Elaine agreed, stating that they must strike directly at the enemy leader. Walter added that while eliminating their smaller camps was important, it ultimately meant nothing because the army could simply rebuild new camps whenever they wished. Elaine mentioned to herself that there were a few advanced spells she wanted to try out in combat, but before she could finish her sentence, Walter dashed directly in front of her to block her path. He asked his lady to reassure him that she was not seriously leaving to exterminate the entire army all by herself at this very moment. Elaine scratched her head in slight embarrassment and admitted that of course she was not doing that, explaining that she would much rather have a competent knight order go in her place, though the exact whereabouts of the enemy leader were still unknown. Walter saluted her, remarking that those cautious words certainly comforted him as her loyal servant. Suddenly, Gast noticed something unusual in the distance and asked what that growing noise was, panicking as he guessed that it might be a sudden charge from the goblin army. Walter stepped forward and corrected him, explaining that the distinct sound of galloping horseshoes meant the Noah's Night order had officially arrived, with Lord Clement personally leading the charge. Elaine smiled at the news, noting that it was absolute perfect timing for them to arrive in the middle of the night. Gast watched the vast horde of monsters ahead and noted nervously that the enemy forces had grown by a whole 1,000 just since they had started watching, asking if the knights were truly going to be okay against such numbers. Elaine calmly calculated the total, noting that the final count of the enemy army now stood at 6,000 monsters. Gast remarked that either way, there were far too many enemies, pointing out that an extra 1,000 barely made a difference when facing such a massive force, especially considering that the fighting force on their side consisted of just Duke Clement and 3 knights. Walter then approached his lady and reported that everyone was officially in position, adding that he had successfully hidden their presence using his own concealment magic this time. Gast complimented Walter, noting that he was exceptionally good at hiding himself and concealing other things. Elaine declared that it was time to get going, and she immediately began chanting an ancient spell, calling upon the great spirit of fire to unearth and smelt every last stone with its evanescing power, commanding the sky to show the overturning of a great cauldron above the earth. In her mind, she remembered that this was a specific spell her daughter Lily had often used in her past life to wipe out massive groups of enemy forces in a single blow. A massive explosion ripped through the battlefield, sending the terrified goblins running in total chaos. Elaine immediately cast another high-level spell, Gehenna Matrium, causing the dark night sky to light up as giant burning meteors began falling from above. Gast was completely shocked by the sight, asking if that was a giant ball of fire hovering in the air. Walter was equally stunned, recognizing the incantation as lost ancient magic and expressing his shock that anyone in the modern age could still command such power. Multiple giant explosions shook the ground across the enemy lines, In Elaine's mind, she estimated that her magical bombardment had probably taken out around a third of the entire goblin army, though she noted with dissatisfaction that it still did not compare to the immense destructive power Lily used to display, realizing the vast difference in their overall mana levels and telling herself that she needed to work much harder. Suddenly, Elaine paused as her body trembled, catching her breath after expending so much energy. Walter quickly moved close to support her, offering his assistance, and Elaine thanked him warmly for his care. Gas suggested that she take a well-deserved rest, guessing that her husband had probably rushed all the way here out of personal worry for her safety. Elaine quickly denied the idea, claiming that the Duke had only hurried to the field out of deep concern for his suffering people, though she assured them she was feeling much better now. Declaring that it was time for everyone to move out and engage the enemy, she promised to cast supportive magic on the fighters. Elaine chanted her supportive spell, Plitor Tygo Shahar, causing a radiant, powerful aura to envelop the knights as well as Gast and Walter. Empowered by the magic, the group surged forward into battle. Gast shot an arrow with incredible precision into a goblin, laughingly exclaiming how crazy the magic felt as his entire body felt as light as a feather. While effortlessly slashing through groups of goblins, Walter remarked that he felt as though he could take on 1,000 more monsters without any trouble at all. Observing the battle from her position, Elaine noted in her thoughts that while the normal goblins were being wiped out without any trouble, the spellcasting goblin mages were managing to hang on and cause serious hassle for the troops. One goblin mage let out a loud shriek as it tried to launch an attack, but Elaine instantly cast her skill, Flame Javelin, to destroy the threat. She then called out to Walter, instructing him that they should focus all their efforts on taking out the remaining goblin mages as fast as possible. Walter agreed with his lady's orders immediately. Elaine noted that aside from taking out the magic casters, the dangerous goblin general still remained to be dealt with, emphasizing that this entire battle would be completely pointless if the main boss managed to escape. Walter concurred, stating that it would indeed be troublesome if the leader survived and set up a new camp somewhere else. Gas pointed out that given how chaotic the battlefield had become, the smart general would surely understand its severe disadvantage and try to move away accordingly. Suddenly, Gas noticed a hidden presence nearby and shouted a loud warning for the target not to make any sudden movements. He quickly drew an arrow back and launched it through the air, but the projectile struck a stone wall instead of his target. Gast apologized for his mistake, realizing that his shot had accidentally given away their position and feeling deeply embarrassed by the miss. Elaine praised Gast for his quick reaction and told him he had done well, assuring him that she would return shortly. Walter moved with incredible speed toward the back of a hidden goblin, but a bright light suddenly erupted in front of him. Walter recognized the phenomenon as a protective magic barrier, expressing his surprise that the creature was not a standard magic caster. An explosion rocked the ground, leading Walter to remark on how unusual the situation was, while Gast shouted in shock, asking what on earth was wrong with that strange monster. Elaine explained that because the monster was using specialized magic tools, it was actually a rare goblin rune knight. She observed that a few precious gems had somehow been mixed in with the rubbish of the normal army. She ordered Walter to go ahead and stop the giant general while she handled the rune knight herself, and Walter agreed immediately. The goblin smirked and laughed at her, but Elaine calmly cast her ice javelin spell. The agile monster moved fast and barely avoided the frozen projectile, quickly launching a sharp dagger directly back toward her. Elaine smoothly dodged the incoming weapon. Seeing his attack miss, the goblin smirked, assuming he had gained the upper hand. However, blood suddenly spurted out from the monster's mouth as its body crashed heavily onto the hard ground. Elaine remarked that the creature had foolishly let its guard down, noting that an enemy could not afford to relax simply because they had managed to dodge an initial attack once. After all, her personal rank in spell control was at the legendary heroic class. Meanwhile, on a different part of the battlefield, fresh blood dripped onto the dirt amid heavy breathing. A giant goblin general stood tall over Walter, who was kneeling on the ground. Gast shouted out in a panic, asking the old butler if he was all right. Walter casually wiped his face, taking a calm breath, which relieved a shocked Gast, who realized the man was completely fine despite the dramatic scene. Walter remarked that the encounter had been rather dangerous. Gast questioned his statement, pointing out that the giant monster was actually the one completely soaked through with blood. The giant goblin general raised its heavy weapon high into the air and let out a loud, piercing shriek. Gast frantically asked what was happening, and Elaine explained that the monster was wielding a cursed weapon that had been blessed with a magical spell or divine spirit. She noted that while the actual effects of such weapons vary greatly, they all shared a major drawback by enhancing the wielder's physical strength far beyond their natural limits. Gast cut her off, shouting that while her lecture was very interesting, they really did not have time for a lesson at that exact moment. The giant monster smashed its heavy weapon down toward them, but the group moved smoothly to dodge the crushing blow. As they ran faster to outmaneuver the beast, Gast frantically asked what their plan was, pointing out that the creature was a total monster. Elaine agreed, stating that they simply needed to defeat it before it could cause any more destruction. The giant goblin kept wildly swinging its massive weapon, and Elaine gracefully dodged every single strike. She raised both of her hands toward the beast and cast her Earthbind spell. In her mind, she knew the Earthen spell would probably not hold the giant back for more than a brief moment, but she recognized that a single moment was all her butler needed to finish the job. Taking advantage of the brief opening, Walter leaped high into the air above the trapped monster. Launching himself downward, he delivered a clean, powerful slash directly through the giant goblin general, declaring that the fight was officially over. As the severed head flew through the air, Elaine positioned herself perfectly and caught the giant goblin head right in her hands. Gast covered his mouth in total disgust, asking why on earth she would catch such a gross object. Elaine explained that the head would first serve as official proof that they had completely exterminated the threat, and second, it was a great material for fashioning valuable magical tools. Walter scratched his head apologetically, admitting it had not occurred to him that the head would be useful to her, but Elaine told him not to worry, taking the blame for not mentioning her request earlier. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out Elaine's name from across the field. Turning around, she saw her husband, Clement, approaching them. She greeted him happily, expressing her surprise that he had come all the way over here, even though he had his hands completely full cleaning up the other battle locations. Clement explained that he would have to leave again very soon, but he just wanted to personally make sure that she was safe. His words trailed off as the severed goblin head in Elaine's hands suddenly let out a low growl. Elaine casually mentioned that this was the head of the enemy general, adding that she was just wondering where she should leave it. Clement offered to take the head off her hands for the official report. In Elaine's mind, she reflected on how everything had gone completely as planned, feeling glad that she had finally gotten a real taste of a true battlefield again. However, after witnessing the limits of her current power during the fight, she realized that she would still not be able to win against her future daughter Lily in a pure contest of magic, acknowledging that she still had a long way to go to change their tragic fate. The difference in their mana levels was simply too vast, creating a massive gap that she knew could never be bridged through sheer effort alone. She contemplated whether she should begin developing specialized magic apparatuses to serve as external support for her power. However, she quickly realized that she needed to focus heavily on her physical combat skills as well, rather than relying solely on her magic abilities. Suddenly, little Ruka approached her with a bright smile, calling out her name and offering her a small gift. Elaine expressed her gentle surprise, asking the young girl what she was holding out to her. Clement explained that while they were out on patrol, the little girl had come up to the knights and mentioned that she had something special she desperately wanted to give to his wife. Looking down at the present, Elaine asked if it was a demon squirrel tail. Ruka happily confirmed that it was, explaining that everyone in the village had carefully searched all around the fields, though this single tail was all they were able to find. The surrounding villagers all smiled warmly at Elaine, and Ruka expressed her deep gratitude, cheerfully telling the noblewoman that everyone in the community was so happy because of her help. Gast admitted that he really had to hand it to her, acknowledging that the Duchess was truly impressive. The old village chief added that it was entirely thanks to the madam's quick actions that their entire village had been saved from total destruction. Clement turned to his wife and expressed his own personal thanks as well, pointing out that if not for her brave choices, countless citizens could have lost their homes, their livelihoods, or even their very lives. Elaine maintained a completely plain poker face, quietly stating that she had not done anything worthy of receiving such immense thanks. Walter commented with a warm smile that his lady was simply being far too modest about her heroic deeds. In her mind, Elaine was completely bewildered by their praise, reflecting on how she had actually just been trying to gain real battle experience to protect her own future. She turned to the little girl and offered her thanks, mentioning that the squirrel tail would make a wonderful toy for her newborn son, Sieg. Both Gast and Ruka gasped in total shock upon hearing that the young, powerful woman was already a mother. Ruka smiled brightly and cheerfully declared that Elaine was so pretty, strong, and cool, admiring how she seemed capable of doing anything and praising her as such an amazing mother. Elaine fell into a quiet silence for a moment, softly replying that she truly hoped she could be just that. A young girl excitedly tried to demonstrate a magic technique to a tiny baby boy, placing her hand on a smooth crystal ball to show him how it worked, though the infant watched her with a thoroughly confused expression. Sitting nearby inside the moving carriage, a nobleman wondered out loud if the girl would be all right for her upcoming mana assessment, remarking that using magic ought to be second nature for a child of noble blood. Paying no mind to his doubts, the girl continued chatting with the baby, proudly declaring that her strongest magic element was fire. Sensing her restlessness, the nobleman firmly asked her about the proper behavior for riding in a carriage. Sitting down obediently, the girl stated that one must sit completely still, though in her mind she bitterly complained about how boring carriages were and how much her rear end hurt from the bumpy ride. Suddenly, a violent strike pierced the side of the carriage, startling the young girl. Outside in the open sky, a massive flying monster hovered over the road as panicked voices announced a sudden monster attack, forcing the carriage to come to an immediate halt. From inside, the nobleman ordered his attendant to raise a magic shield right away. The attendant outside frantically replied that he could not cast it because he lacked any mana. The nobleman berated him as a fool, shouting that even an incompetent person could activate the tool, and handed the heavy item out. Struggling to hold the shield up to his chest, the attendant doubted whether the heavy object would even work, but the nobleman urged him to hurry and make good use of the 10 gold coins he had spent on it. Instantly, a brilliant light burst forth, blinding the flying beast. As both men watched in amazement, the monster tried to pierce the light, only to be completely blocked. Cheering at the shield's success, the nobleman urged everyone to use the opening to make their escape. However, before they could move, the barrier suddenly cracked and shattered under a follow-up strike. The immense force overturned the entire carriage, throwing the young girl onto the dirt roads, where she lay unconscious. The flying monster swooped down to capture the defenseless girl, but a powerful strike suddenly hit the beast mid-air. A noble woman stood tall in the background, effortlessly battling the creature. Moments later, the threat was neutralized, and the dead monster lay motionless on the ground. The girl's mother bowed deeply, expressing her overwhelming gratitude and admitting she did not know what would have happened if the Duke's carriage had not been passing by. Elaine modestly told the mother not to worry about it, though in her mind she noted that she had simply taken down a wild beast that happened to be blocking their path. After saving the girl, Elaine gently cast healing magic over Mary's injuries. Nearby, the nobleman cursed in a fury, complaining that the greedy mages from the magic tower were charging a fortune for absolute junk. Noticing the man's condition, Elaine offered to heal his injuries as well, but the nobleman quickly dismissed it. Seeing his arrogant attitude, Elaine quietly decided in her mind to leave his bruise unhealed, claiming his minor bruise was nothing compared to protecting his child, though she felt a bit sorry that the lovely young girl had such a father. Inside their private carriage, Clement smiled down at their infant son, asking young Sieg if his mother was not the most amazing person in the world. 1 year after the successful subjugation of the Goblin army, the family traveled toward the church located just outside Naos, the capital of the Fallen's territory. Clement looked out the window and noted that they were almost at their destination, asking his wife if she was ready for the big day. Elaine casually asked what she was supposed to be ready for, stating that whether Sieghart possessed mana or not did not matter to her in the slightest. Clement pointed out that having magic would still be a wonderful gift for the boy, but Elaine noted that great talent often invited dangerous jealousy, making it perfectly fine if he turned out to be ordinary. Clement asked if she truly felt that way, and she firmly confirmed that she did. Upon entering the grand church, the local priest greeted the Duke and Duchess with deep respect. The priest announced that, in accordance with tradition, they would now conduct the official mana assessment for their young child to examine his total mana capacity and identify his elemental affinity. Guiding the family forward, the priest instructed them to place the baby's hand upon the crystal ball. Little Sieg reached out and pressed his tiny hand against the glowing sphere. Watching the reaction, the priest gasped in shock, revealing that the boy possessed a mana capacity of the absolute highest class, giving him the potential to become a truly legendary mage. However, as he examined the elemental affinity, the priest grew solemn, revealing that the child surprisingly possessed no specific elemental specialty. He explained that while such an outcome was rare, it meant that regardless of how vast his mana store was, her son might find it nearly impossible to ever cast a single spell. Sometime later back at their estate, Clement looked at Elaine with a deep sigh, asking his wife to forgive his earlier optimism. While Elaine was busy working, Clement entered the room to deliver a letter addressed to her. Still focused on her tasks, Elaine asked if her husband could simply leave the letter on her desk for the time being. Clement agreed without hesitation and took the opportunity to mention the progress on the custom magic device she had been developing. He referred specifically to her innovative shock absorption system designed for carriages, recalling that because the mechanism was somewhat bulky, she had left the final installation to professional carriage craftsmen, who had just reported that the work would be ready very soon. Later on, Elaine stepped outside to take a breath of fresh air. Clement approached her and asked if he was disturbing her, but she reassured him that it was completely fine, noting that she had desperately needed a change of pace anyway. Looking closely at her husband's face, she pointed out how surprisingly grim he looked, leaning in close to him. Blushing slightly at her sudden closeness, Clement apologized and asked if his troubled thoughts were really that obvious. Elaine gently asked if he was still deeply worried about the poor results of young Sieg's mana assessment. Clement admitted his fears, pointing out that there were countless mages among the upper nobility, and expressing his constant anxiety over the idea that their son might grow up unable to protect himself or resist those who held immense magical power. Elaine reassured him that she understood his protective feelings all too well, which was precisely why she believed Sieg needed a personal magic shield device. Clement assumed she meant buying one from the market, remarking that the shield devices currently available to the public were of terribly poor quality. Elaine clarified that she was not planning to buy an existing model, but intended to design and create a brand new one all by herself. Clement looked thoroughly shocked by her declaration, reminding her that the elite magic tower held a strict monopoly over all magic shield technology. Elaine acknowledged his concern, remembering that this was indeed how the current political climate stood. In her mind, she reflected on how the magic tower was one of the nation's most leading magical institutions, operating with far more self-serving isolation than any other group. In the name of magical research, its leaders completely ignored all moral ethics and even rejected direct intervention from the king himself, getting away with their arrogant behavior solely due to their vast wealth. The profits from the monopolized magic shield devices, in particular, flowed directly into the tower's massive vaults. Elaine remembered that in her previous life, she had been the one to declare a full-scale commercial war against them, designing her own superior shield device, hiring independent craftsmen to build it, and successfully stealing their market share. However, seeing how worried her young husband had become, she quickly reassured Clement that she would not start a fight with the magic tower this time, telling him to calm down. Clement let out a sigh, remarking on how pathetic he felt for doing nothing but worrying while she was doing everything in her power for Sieghart's sake. Elaine reacted with gentle sympathy, reflecting in her mind that when it came to parenting, she possessed an unfair advantage thanks to her 30 years of future memories. She knew that by today's standards, Sieg might seem completely powerless, and among the 4 children she would eventually bear, he was technically the weakest in raw magic. Yet, she felt no real worry for his future, because she knew that all her children were inherently exceptional, each possessing a unique, extraordinary power. She then vividly remembered a tragic scene from her past life. A young Sieg stood tall before a burning, destroyed house, turning to greet Elaine as she arrived and calmly reporting that the violent task was already over. Elaine praised her eldest son, noting that he had handled the entire raid all by himself. Sieg declared that there was now nothing left standing in their way, dismissing the desperate warnings of a certain prophetess as nothing more than the meaningless threats of an ant. On the blood-stained ground nearby, a severely injured woman struggled to speak, begging Elaine not to go through with her dark path and insisting that it was not too late to turn back. Sieg stepped heavily onto the dying woman's hand, addressing her as Celine and remarking that while he had once been quite fond of her, he could never accept her terrifying prophecy that warned the king of the fallen's family's impending treason. Celine gasped out that despite everything, she still considered herself to be Elaine's closest friend, begging the Duchess to wake up from her madness and not lose her way. In the memory, Elaine had simply stood over her dying friend, laughing out loud in a cruel, mocking tone. She had declared that she was perfectly sane and claimed that Celine was the one foolishly dreaming, asking what good a prophet's power was if it could not even foresee the total annihilation of her own family's noble house. Elaine had coldly bade goodbye to Celine, calling her a traitorous best friend, before turning her back and walking away alongside her son while the dying woman reached out, desperately crying for them not to follow that dark star. Sieg had then sparked a fire that consumed the scene, causing Elaine to suddenly wake up in the present day with cold sweat dripping down her face. In her mind, she reflected on how hopelessly naive and cruel she had been back then. That terrible prophecy had been the ultimate trigger for her downfall, and even though so much of their future ruin had been warned ahead of time, she and her son had felt so foolishly proud of their temporary victory. Staring up at her room, Elaine swore to herself that she would do far better this time and protect her family properly. Elaine pulled herself up from her bed and took a few slow steps toward her desk, where her eyes landed on an unopened letter resting quietly on the wood. Before she could pick it up, a voice called out from behind the closed door, announcing that Lady Celine had arrived and urging her to prepare herself immediately. Hearing that name brought a rush of complex memories to Elaine. Celine Blastery was a prophetess and an old friend who had once cared for Elaine more than anyone else in the world. Yet in another time, she had also been Elaine's bitter enemy, the very person Elaine had eventually killed, despite all the warmth they had shared as best friends. When Celine entered the room, she greeted Elaine with familiar warmth, noting how much time had passed since they last saw each other more than a year ago. Elaine did not answer with words. Instead, she walked straight up to her friend and pulled her into a tight, sudden embrace. Celine chuckled softly at the intense greeting, lightheartedly joking that a hug so desperate and strong ought to be saved for a husband. Elaine only laughed in response, feeling in her heart that she needed no one's permission to hold her dearest friend close. Celine gently teased her further, explaining that she had taken the trouble to visit in person only because Elaine had been ignoring every letter sent to her. Sensing a brief moment of hesitation from Elaine, Celine softened her tone and admitted she was only joking, quickly shifting the topic to the subject of her own power. Celine spoke of her mysterious ability known as prophecy, a rare and unpredictable gift that allowed her to see glimpses of what was yet to come. It was an imperfect vision, and in the early days when the overwhelming weight of those glimpses used to terrify Celine, Elaine had been the only person to offer comfort, praising her and telling her how truly amazing she was. Because of that bond, Celine had used her power to quietly watch over Elaine's future for a very long time. Sitting down together to talk properly, Elaine silently signaled her curiosity about what those visions had shown, wondering if a happy life awaited her. Celine's light mood faded into a heavy silence. She revealed that while a person's path usually splits into countless different branches, some filled with light and others with shadow, Elaine's future had always been dominated by a single, dark star that seemed to draw her toward it every time Celine looked. However, when Celine checked her visions earlier that morning, the strange darkness had suddenly begun to fade. While a fading dark star was clearly a hopeful sign, Celine had no idea what could have caused such a sudden shift. Terrified that something terrible might have happened to her friend to alter destiny so drastically, she had rushed over out of sheer worry. Listening to this, Elaine knew in her mind that there was only one possible explanation for the change. She remembered her previous life, where keeping her dark ambitions secret had slowly turned her into Celine's enemy and ruined everything between them. Deciding that she would not walk that hidden path again, Elaine chose to tell Celine the absolute truth. She stated plainly and seriously that she had already lived a full life and died once before. Celine's immediate reaction was surprisingly calm, as she simply waited for the rest of the statement, leaving Elaine momentarily stunned by her lack of panic. Celine pointed out that dying could hardly be the end of the tale, prompting Elaine to explain that the version of herself who had perished was actually 30 years into the future. Celine quickly calculated that Elaine must have lived until she was around 50 years old. Elaine confirmed this, explaining that after dying at that age, she had mysteriously woken up back in her younger body, exactly 1 year in the past. Elaine went on to lay out the full horror of her past existence. She confessed that her future self had secretly plotted to overthrow the ruler and claim the throne, unleashing chaos across the entire kingdom. Though she had come remarkably close to total victory, her rise to power was cut short when her own youngest daughter turned against her and took her life. To make matters worse, Elaine admitted that after her friendship with Celine dissolved into hatred, she had ordered one of her own children to murder Celine. At this revelation, Celine flinched and pulled back in genuine terror. Elaine tried to calm her, insisting it was the absolute truth and asking her not to be so frightened. Celine admitted that she was not just surprised, but deeply shocked by the cruelty of that alternate reality. Elaine reassured her friend that she had no intention of repeating those dark mistakes or following the same path to destruction, promising that she would handle her destiny much better this time around. Watching Elaine speak, Celine felt a wave of mixed emotions. She realized that Elaine had not entirely given up on her sharp ambition, yet Celine found herself feeling an unexpected sense of peace. Elaine had changed, or rather, she had returned to the bright, passionate person she used to be, the brilliant soul Celine had admired so much when they first met. Elaine explained that her current goal was to train hard so she would be strong enough to avoid being killed by her future daughter. Before Celine could question her further, Elaine cut in to add that she also intended to build a friendly alliance with an organization she had once treated as a deadly enemy. To make that happen, she needed Celine's help. Celine hesitated, saying she could not agree to anything without knowing the details first. In response, Elaine put on a charming, persuasive expression that she knew Celine could never resist. Celine broke into laughter at the playful gesture, unable to stay firm. Elaine smiled to herself, knowing that almost everyone had a soft spot for that look, especially a certain short-tempered ally she had in mind. Just then, the atmosphere shifted as a knight shouted from nearby, announcing that the magic shields were fully set, the device was activated, and everything was ready for action. Hearing the signal, Elaine adjusted her hand, focused her strength, and cast her spell. Elaine cast her stone javelin spell, launching the stone projectile forward until it smashed directly into a shield, which deflected the attack effortlessly. Amazed by how well the barrier held up, the knight removed his helmet and threw it aside in excitement. The knight, named Horst, praised the wonderful magic device, declaring that with its help he could fight far better than before. His fellow knight tried to get his attention by calling him captain, but Horst was too thrilled to listen, insisting that the invention would save countless lives during monster hunts and serve as a reliable second shield for all their fighters. Elaine asked him if he truly believed, as an experienced warrior, that it could act as their second shield. Horst agreed completely, noting that it was vastly superior to the traditional devices created by the Magic Tower, though he warned that the Magic Tower would be in serious trouble if word of this technology got out. Realizing the political danger, Horst grew angry and questioned if Elaine was planning to let House Fallens claim the magic device to weaken the magic tower's authority. Elaine simply smiled at him in response. In her mind, she remembered trying that exact aggressive approach in her past life, which had ultimately led to her death. She explained that this time, she intended to handle the situation peacefully without creating unnecessary conflict, as that was the best path forward. She went on to explain that she would soon be traveling to the royal capital to visit the magic tower itself, and she asked Horst to arrange a group of knights to protect her along the way. Horst readily accepted the task, but suddenly misinterpreted her intentions and excitedly questioned if they were actually launching an attack on the tower, causing his subordinate to call out to him in exasperation once again. Meanwhile, outside the royal capital in the Kingdom of Istoward stands Elkadrat, the famous magic tower. A magic spirit bird created by Elaine flew over the tower walls and landed gently near an open window. A young hooded girl welcomed the bird, recognizing it as a messenger pigeon intended for the master of the tower. Nearby, two mages watched her with annoyance. One complained about her constant presence, while the other wondered why someone like her was even allowed inside the magic tower. They grumbled that she was only kept around because she was the tower master's favorite, even though she was only good for running simple errands. The two men continued whispering behind her back, claiming that if Tower Master Candelario kept favoring her, he would not hold his high position for much longer. They even brought up a rumor that he had recently fled from a practice battle against a rival named Tobias, mocking him and wondering if old age was finally making him weak. The young girl heard their harsh whispers and worried in her heart that the complaints against the Tower Master were somehow her fault. Shaking off her sadness, she knocked on the door of the main office. Candelario called from inside, telling Clarice to enter. Clarice stepped through the door, pulled off her hood, and politely greeted Master Candelario. Candelario sighed, mentioning that their ongoing magical experiment was taking far too much time and draining much more mana than they had originally planned. Clarice answered dutifully, promising to do her absolute best to assist whenever he needed her. Candelario chuckled softly and turned his attention to the magic bird she brought, asking if her visit was about that messenger pigeon. Reading the message, he noted that a Duchess was coming to see him. He decided there was no harm in meeting her, reasoning that if he found her unpleasant, he could simply throw her out. Clarice expressed surprise that he would treat a high-ranking Duchess so casually, but Candelario insisted that status made no difference to him, though he admitted the Duchess did sound like an interesting person. When Clarice asked why she was interesting, Candelario reminded her that the Duchess had recently become the talk of the entire royal capital. She was the brilliant creator of several revolutionary items, including a special food preservation storage unit and a magical device used for seeing across long distances. Remembering this, Clarice agreed enthusiastically, sharing that the women in the cafeteria had been praising the Duchess's magic milk warmer, calling it a complete lifesaver for raising their babies. Candelario laughed at the thought, but he still wondered what kind of business such a noblewoman could possibly have with him. He admitted to himself that he had no idea what to expect, as their worlds were entirely different, and he could not even imagine her true motives. Later on, Clarice sat near the main gate of the magic tower, eating her bread while sharing crumbs with the local birds. Suddenly, the bird sensed danger and flew away in fear, leaving Clarice confused. A second later, a heavy, suffocating wave of magical energy washed over the area. Horrified by the intense aura, Clarice wondered if one of the mages had caused a dangerous laboratory explosion, but she quickly realized that the terrifying magic was surging from outside the front gate. Beyond the entrance, Elaine reached out, touched the giant gate, and cast a powerful lava cannon spell, triggering a massive, fiery explosion that blasted the entrance open. As smoke filled the air, Elaine calmly stepped through the ruined gateway. Horst rushed up behind her in a panic, asking if this meant they were conducting a military raid after all. Elaine simply waved her hand dismissively, reassuring him that she had only come to have a peaceful talk. A few hours before reaching their destination, the journey along the road from the outskirts of the royal capital toward the magic tower was quiet and full of tension. A man riding on horseback let out a deep and heavy sigh. Seeing this, Horst turned to him and asked if something was wrong, wondering if he was suffering from a sudden stomachache. The man quickly replied that he had never felt better in his life, but he admitted that he was feeling very nervous simply because they were heading toward the magic tower. He explained that when he was a small child, his parents used to threaten him by saying that if he misbehaved, he would be carried away and handed over to the people of the tower. Inside the traveling carriage, Elaine listened to his words and offered her own thoughts. She remarked that perhaps those childhood warnings were not entirely empty threats after all. If the mages within the tower ever required children to conduct their strange research, they would not pause or hesitate to take them. That was simply the kind of dark and heartless place it truly was. In her own mind, she viewed the tower as a ruthless environment where absolute power was the only thing that mattered. Horst then mentioned that according to recent rumors, the current tower master, Candelario, was known to be a rational and sensible person. Elaine replied that if those rumors were true, she could only hope that the place was no longer as bad as it used to be. Horst asked her if she happened to be personally acquainted with the Tower Master. She answered that she was not. However, deep inside her thoughts, Elaine knew that the person she was actually familiar with was the man destined to become the next Tower Master. She remembered Tobias Anzorge, a man completely driven by endless greed and bitter hatred. He was someone who wasted what little intellect he possessed on maintaining a false pretense. Although the official reports claimed that Candelario had died from a sudden illness, that was merely a lie manufactured for the general public. In truth, the Tower Master had been secretly assassinated. The faction led by Tobias had struck at the exact moment when a dangerous experiment had left Candelario completely drained of all his magical power. That precise moment marked the beginning of the Magic Tower's complete downfall. Elaine was certain that a man like Tobias lacked the true talent required to survive the upcoming war over the valuable rights to magical tools. Reflecting on the past, she realized that even though people said she had orchestrated the entire collapse, all she had really done was throw extra fuel onto an existing fire. The dangerous spark had already been there from the start. She knew that if she simply chose to leave things alone, the ruin of the Magic Tower would become completely unavoidable once again. After all, during her previous life, she had not been the only person eyeing the vast assets and treasures stored within the tower. Her quiet thoughts were interrupted when Horst spoke up, announcing that they had finally arrived at their destination. Looking at the massive entrance before her, Elaine felt a flood of old memories returning as she stared at the giant gate. While they stood waiting at the front, Horst turned to the other man and asked if he knew how a person was supposed to gain entry into the Magic Tower. The man responded by pointing out that their captain was exceptionally good at using magic, and Horst agreed that he was indeed very skilled. Staring up at the huge structure, Elaine remembered the rules of the place clearly. She explained to her companions that in order to test whether a visitor was truly worthy of entering the Magic Tower, a special inscription had been carved directly onto the gate. Horst asked her what kind of inscription it was, and she explained that it was a long poem. It began with the specific line commanding that if a person was a true mage, they must show their power. She told them that one had to decipher the complex poem and follow its precise instructions in order to make the gate open properly. Horst remarked that she seemed remarkably skilled and knowledgeable about the process, and Elaine replied that she supposed she was. In her mind, she remembered that solving the riddle was exactly what she had done the last time she stood here. She had carefully deciphered the entire thing, and that exact decision had been her great mistake. Back then, as soon as she finished solving the complex riddle, the massive gate had swung open. She vividly recalled the past that followed. A man wearing a dark hood had looked at her with a mocking smile, expressing shock that someone had actually come along and solved the puzzle in the proper, traditional way, stating it was his very first time seeing anyone do so. Another hooded man standing beside him had pointed out the opening words of the inscription, noting that the poem simply demanded that a person show their power. As far as he was concerned, as long as the gate opened, any method was acceptable. He had scoffed that if a person possessed the sheer physical or magical strength required to force the heavy doors open, they were more than welcome to try. Returning her thoughts to the present moment, Elaine decided not to waste any time solving the long poem again. Instead, she gathered her magical energy and cast a destructive spell known as lava cannon directly at the structure. A massive, explosive blast ripped through the air and struck the entrance with incredible force. When the thick smoke and dust finally began to fade away, a woman named Clarice was lying on the hard ground just beyond the destroyed entrance. She was squirming in pain, muttering to herself and crying out about the intense heat that filled the air. Suddenly, someone walked up and stood directly in front of her, asking if she was all right. When Clarice forced herself to look up through the lingering haze, she instantly recognized the man standing above her. She gasped out the name of Lord Tobias. Tobias turned to look down at her with a confident grin. He observed the damage and remarked that the incoming strike seemed like a rather half-baked attack. Nevertheless, he declared that he would protect her simply because she belonged to the Magic Tower. A moment later, another man rushed over to the scene in a hurry, calling out Tobias's name. The newcomer reported that while there were fortunately no other casualties among their people, the main gate had been completely ruined. Clarice looked on in utter shock, wonderingly asking if the people outside were meant to be their incoming guests. Tobias replied that if those people were attempting to follow the tower's absurd old tradition, then they technically were guests, though to his eyes they looked much more like aggressive attackers. The other man grew deeply worried, noting that the situation was very bad, as anyone capable of unleashing that level of destructive power must be insanely focused on mastering the fire element. However, Tobias looked closely at the lingering magical energy, shook his head, and replied that he was wrong, stating that the magic used for the blast was not fire-based at all. Elaine stepped forward, her calm demeanor contrasting sharply with the tension in the air. Inside Tobias's mind, Chaos reigned as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. She had cast opposing elements, flame and ice, without speaking a single word or chanting an incantation. Presenting herself with quiet poise, Elaine offered a courteous greeting, wishing them a good day. As she looked around at the destroyed gate and the defensive posture of the mages, she noted to herself that this hardly felt like a proper welcome party. She wondered briefly if simply blasting the gate open had not been enough to satisfy their demand to show her power. As she continued walking, one of the mages took action, launching a dangerous water javelin spell directly toward her. Without breaking her stride, Elaine casually deflected the incoming attack. A subtle smirk touched her face as she realized their true intention. They wanted her to prove her strength through actual physical combat. Accepting the challenge with a small smile, she cast her spell, Heres Helem. Spotting the magical aura forming around her, Tobias shouted at the top of his lungs, warning his men that an attack was coming and ordering them to raise their defensive shields immediately. However, several of his men failed to react in time and were struck directly by the incoming magic. Tobias stared in utter shock at the fallen spellcasters. In his mind, he could not make sense of what was happening. Magical arrows were flying through the air, but the men under his command were far from weak. They were experienced mages who should not have fallen from a simple volley like that. Frustrated and confused, he turned to Clarice and ordered her to fall back immediately. He pointed out that since she was unable to use magic, she would only get in the way during a fight of this scale. Clarice agreed right away, promising to go fetch reinforcements and telling him to stay safe before running off as fast as she could. Left behind on the field, Tobias felt a strange sense of unease as he sensed Elaine's mana, while Elaine quietly watched the non-combatant leave. Standing face to face with Tobias, Elaine thanked him for allowing the young woman to retreat safely. Tobias let out a grim grin and questioned why she was thanking him, asking if that wasn't something she herself should be saying. Elaine replied simply that the girl was clearly a non-combatant. Observing Tobias closely, Elaine noted in her thoughts how different he seemed compared to her past memories of him. It was not merely that he looked younger. His entire presence felt distinct from the tyrant she once knew. Tobias declared that he had always thought the old Tower Master was the only true monster around, but now that circumstances had brought them to this point, he refused to back down. He proclaimed that he, Tobias Anzorge, would face her with everything he possessed. In an instant, Tobias moved with astonishing speed, vanishing from her line of sight and reappearing directly behind Elaine. Believing he had caught her completely off guard, he announced that she was wide open and unleashed a lethal attack. To his complete disbelief, his strike was instantly blocked by a powerful barrier. Stunned, Tobias questioned how a mere magic shield could possibly withstand such a blow, wondering when she had even found the time to cast it. Before he could recover, Elaine extended her arm and cast Stone Spear to counterattack. Tobias reacted instantly, dodging the sharp rock just in time. Sweat poured down his face as he desperately wondered who this unknown woman could possibly be. She was moving and reacting as if she already knew every single one of his secret techniques. Tobias was convinced this was impossible. The technique he had just used was his personal trump card, a newly developed move designed specifically to defeat the old Tower Master, and one he had never revealed in battle before. What Tobias failed to realize was that Elaine understood the mechanics of his move completely. No matter the difference in sheer skill, no warrior could counter a surprise technique they were unfamiliar with. His secret move relied on wind element magic infused with lightning, channeled directly through the body to achieve high-speed movement, allowing him to leap into his opponent's blind spot and target their head. However, Elaine anticipated the move effortlessly and countered it using her Stonewall spell. She knew that his reliance on such a demanding move would no longer work against her. Tobias was growing frantic as he realized her spell activation speed was far too fast for a human. Before he could process his next move, Elaine cast another stone wall. Tobias instinctively shielded himself from the sudden formation of rock, but when he opened his eyes, he discovered that 4 massive stone walls had risen around him, trapping him completely inside a tight square structure. Recognizing the danger, he panicked, shouting in terror as he realized he was trapped. Elaine began her next chant, uttering the word Giganto, followed quickly by cannon. A colossal boulder materialized in the sky above and smashed directly into the center of the stone enclosure with a thunderous crash. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the ruined entrance. Elaine stood quietly in the dust, watching the wreckage. Suddenly, the shattered rocks moved, and Tobias crawled out from the debris. Shaking heavily from pain and shock, he gasped out that he had barely survived the crushing blow. Elaine looked at him with cool amusement, mockingly asking if he was still in one piece. Tobias shouted back angrily, declaring that there was no way he would die in a place like this, and insisting that he could still fight. Elaine calmly advised him to stop, pointing out that she had already shown him more than enough of her power. She warned him that if he continued to rely on his incomplete high-speed technique, his own body would break apart from the strain. Tobias refused to listen, yelling at her to shut up and declaring that if he backed down now, he would never be able to face the comrades he had failed to protect. Before the conflict could escalate any further, an old man suddenly appeared behind Tobias and struck him firmly on the head, declaring that the fight was over. Shocked by the sudden interruption, Tobias turned and recognized the old man, angrily telling the Tower Master not to stop him. Ignoring the young man's protest, the old Tower Master turned toward Elaine, politely asking if the noble lady would be so kind as to assist them. Tobias interjected bitterly, claiming that his fellow mages of the Magic Tower had been killed in her attack. Before Tobias could finish his accusation, Elaine simply snapped her fingers. The moment the sound echoed through the air, the fallen mages on the ground suddenly stirred, coming back to consciousness and groaning as they endured the lingering pain of their minor injuries. One of the recovering mages blinked in confusion, recognizing the presence of the Tower Master standing nearby. Tobias stared in absolute disbelief, pointing out that just a moment ago, the mana flow within their bodies had stopped completely, leading him to believe they were dead. The Tower Master merely looked at Tobias and noted that such an assumption was why he had misjudged the situation, adding that while diligence in one's own training was admirable, true mastery required far greater perception. The Tower Master remarked that calm observation was also a fundamental part of battle, reminding Tobias that he still had much to learn in that regard. Tobias tightly clenched his fist in deep frustration, silently cursing his own lack of composure. Turning her attention back to the host, Elaine stated that she would like to allow them to begin their meeting again from the very start. A short while later, the group was comfortably seated inside the tower. The Tower Master officially greeted his guest, welcoming Duchess Farrens to the Magic Tower. Elaine politely requested that Lord Candelario simply address her by her first name, Elaine. Candelario then voiced his intense curiosity, asking about the extraordinary nature of the magic she had used against his mages outside. Elaine explained that she had fired specialized magical arrows directly into their mana cores to temporarily halt their function without causing lasting harm. Candelario marveled at the technique, pointing out that because the mana core was not a physical organ and its precise location varied from person to person, pinpointing it was extraordinarily difficult. He reasoned that such a complex spell could only ever be wielded by someone capable of visually perceiving individual mana cores. Elaine confirmed that his assessment was entirely correct. Candelario then asked who had originally created such an advanced technique, wondering if it might have been someone else. At that question, Elaine's mind flashed back to a painful memory from her past life. She remembered her younger self standing in disbelief, barely able to speak, questioning how her own magic could have been stolen and used. In that memory, a young woman named Lily had stepped forward with a proud composure, addressing her mother and noting that as expected, most people struck by the technique simply entered a state of suspended motion. Returning to the present moment, Candelario answered his own question, remarking that if someone other than Lady Elaine had developed the move, it only proved that the world was indeed a vast and mysterious place. Elaine agreed with a simple nod, though in her mind, she realized she needed to change the subject immediately. She quickly transitioned to her primary reason for visiting the tower, explaining that she had recently taken up the craft of making magical tools. She pulled out an exquisite necklace and asked if the Tower Master would be kind enough to examine it. Candelario looked closely at the item, asking if this delicate object was truly a magic tool. Elaine confirmed that it was, revealing that it was a portable shield tool she had personally created. Candelario was shocked, unable to believe what he was hearing. Elaine elaborated that this modest necklace was the exact artifact that had effortlessly blocked Lord Tobias's high-speed attack earlier at the gate. The Tower Master trembled in total disbelief, pointing out that as a mage of the Magic Tower, Tobias had used enough mana in that single strike to withstand 10 stone spear attacks all at once. Candelario realized with growing dread that if a small tool possessed that level of defensive power and were ever released onto the open market, the Magic Tower's own line of defensive artifacts would immediately become obsolete and stop selling. Elaine reassured him, explaining that her current version of the shield was significantly more costly to produce. If her house were to compete directly with the Magic Tower, both sides would be forced to lower their prices drastically, resulting in a pointless war where they merely fought over scraps of profit. Candelario acknowledged that neither party desired such a destructive outcome, and he asked what alternative she had in mind. Elaine proposed that House Farrens and the Magic Tower should share the production and distribution of the magic tool together. Candelario was surprised, asking why she would willingly share her own creation, as doing so would seem to put her at a distinct disadvantage. Elaine explained that it would not put her at a loss at all. By partnering with them, her house would gain direct access to the vast sales channels the Magic Tower commanded. Furthermore, they could drastically reduce manufacturing costs by utilizing the refined mass production techniques the tower had perfected over many years. She then revealed another key part of her plan, stating that she intended to recruit common artisans from the city to assist in manufacturing these tools. Candelario was taken aback, noting that city artisans had only ever been capable of producing simple, inexpensive items. However, Candelario quickly grasped the deeper tactical implication behind her words. Elaine knew the hidden truth. In the original timeline, those very same city artisans would eventually receive funding from wealthy merchants, allowing them to advance their research until, within 10 years, they grew powerful enough to become dangerous enemies of the Magic Tower. Realizing this, Candelario noted that Lady Elaine intended to bring those artisans into their business structure before they ever had the chance to become a threat. Although impressed, Candelario admitted that it was difficult to commit to such a massive agreement on such short notice. Understanding his hesitation, Elaine stood up from her seat, stating that she would take her leave for now and look forward to receiving a favorable reply from him soon. In her mind, she was confident that Candelario would ultimately agree to the deal. However, to ensure that the outcome was completely sealed in her favor, she paused and added that she had one final proposal to offer. Just as she spoke those words, the door to the room suddenly burst open. Tobias shouted out for the old man, only to freeze in place when he unexpectedly saw Elaine standing right by the doorway. Elaine looked at him with a composed smile, asking if Lord Tobias also had business with the Tower Master, and politely thanking him for waiting outside. As she observed the young man, Elaine silently pondered the strange turn of events, wondering how things had managed to unfold in this completely new direction. Tobias grew irritated, demanding to know what she was talking about. Ignoring his anger, Elaine walked past him and quietly remarked that they should both do their best this time. Her words left Tobias completely confused as she departed. Watching her leave, Candelario remarked with a subtle laugh that it seemed Tobias was having a hard time dealing with her, especially after getting beaten so thoroughly in their fight. Tobias snapped back in denial, declaring that was not true at all, but he quickly caught himself, scratched his face awkwardly, and admitted that perhaps he really had been beaten. Candelario expressed mild surprise, asking if he was actually accepting his defeat so easily. Tobias replied that he was not shameless enough to pretend he hadn't lost after taking such a thorough beating. Candelario observed that Tobias's usual arrogance seemed to have faded, reflecting that if he had known a defeat would humble him so well, he would have beaten him in a mock battle long ago. He admitted he had always avoided direct combat with Tobias, believing it was unwise for a clear victor to be decided between their opposing factions within the tower. Tobias let out a sigh, asking if that was truly the only reason he had held back. Candelario affirmed that maintaining a delicate balance was extremely important. Tobias thought about the concept of balance and questioned whether favoring Clarice was also part of that strategy. He pointed out that within the Magic Tower, where absolute power was supposed to be everything, the Tower Master was giving special treatment to someone who could not even use magic. He asked Candelario if he did not find such a situation odd, noting that the younger mages in particular were growing increasingly resentful of the favoritism. Tobias clarified that he was not suggesting Clarice should be kicked out of the tower entirely, but rather that every single person in the facility should be evaluated and treated strictly according to their actual magical ability. Before Tobias could finish explaining his reasoning, Candelario unexpectedly agreed with him, stating that his points were quite correct. However, the Tower Master added that Tobias was completely mistaken about one crucial detail. His gentle expression vanished, replaced by a cold, dark smirk as he revealed that Clarice was not a favored pupil at all, but rather an experimental subject.